I don't know if you remember, but I'm the person who actually made the announcement of the Queen's death. And we there was a great concern that Meghan was going to exploit the situation and come out with one of her nonsensical but very damaging and destructive announcements like,
The silence within the grey stone walls of Balmoral Castle was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a coup d'etat. The mantelpiece clock in the private quarters struck 4 o'clock, but for the courtiers gathered in the shadows of the Highland estate, time had already frozen into a jagged shard of ice. The sovereign, a woman who had personified duty for more than 70 years, had drawn her final breath. Yet, as the life faded from the halls of the castle, a predatory energy was surging thousands of miles away. This was not a moment for mourning in the Sussex camp. It was a tactical window for an unprecedented media insurrection. What the world does not know, what the mainstream narrative has fought to bury, is that as the Queen's heart ceased to beat, a calculated plot was being activated. The operator was not merely planning to attend the deathbed. She was preparing to transform the sanctity of the royal, passing into a global stage for her own brand of victimhood. The plan was as audacious as it was cruel: to force her way to the bedside of the dying 96-year-old monarch and immediately leak a narrative of exclusion and racial bias to the international press. It was to be the ultimate weaponization of a grandmother's final moments. But the monarchy, an institution built over 10 centuries of survival, does not remain defenseless. While the public waited in agonizing uncertainty, a shadow war was being waged through encrypted lines and hushed corridors. The goal of the palace was simple but desperate: protect the Queen's dignity from the woman they had come to fear most. Enter Lady Colin Campbell. In a move that sent shockwaves through the diplomatic circles of London, she did the unthinkable. She broke the ancient protocol of silence. At exactly 4 o'clock on that fateful afternoon of September 8th, 2022, she authorized the release of the news. Why did she risk her reputation to preempt the official announcement from Buckingham Palace by more than 2 hours? Because she knew. She knew that if the news of the Queen's death remained unofficial for a moment longer, the Sussex camp would fill that vacuum with a poisonous fiction. By forcing the hand of the establishment at 4 o'clock, she effectively stripped Meghan Markle of her primary weapon, the element of surprise. Imagine the fury within the Sussex camp when they realized the narrative had been seized from their grasp. They had expected the palace to remain paralyzed by tradition until 6 o'clock or later. Instead, the world was already whispering the truth before Harry had even set foot on the tarmac of Aberdeen Airport. The strategic announcement at 4 o'clock was the first strike in a counteroffensive that saved the dignity of the crown. And what of Prince Harry? The man who was once the Queen's favorite grandson was now a ghost in his own family's house. As his private flight ascended, his phone became a tomb of missed calls and disconnected lines. The Prince of Wales, William, had made the decision. There would be no coordination. There would be no sharing of the grief with the man who had spent the last 2 years setting fire to his own heritage. Harry was left to discover the death of his grandmother via the internet, a brutal but necessary act of isolation to prevent any further leaks to the Sussex media machine. This was not an accident. It was a clinical, surgical excision. The family had realized that any information given to Harry was information given to the woman who sought to dismantle them. At Balmoral, the doors were barred. The instructions were absolute. Meghan Markle was not to be permitted on the property. Not now, not ever. The king himself, Charles, had to deliver the final word. A conversation that left Harry in a state of impotent rage while the world watched his frantic, solitary journey toward a castle that had already closed its heart to him. Why were the courtiers so terrified of a single woman's presence at the bedside? What did they see in the Duchess that Harry remained blind to? The answer lies in the private journals of those who witnessed the sheer malice of the Sussex era. While the public mourned, the insiders were unloading on a betrayal so complete that it made the scandal of Edward VIII look like a minor disagreement. They saw a woman who didn't see a dying grandmother, but a content opportunity. As we move into the next chapter of this dark history, we must ask, how did a Hollywood actress manage to turn a grandson against his dying grandfather and his ailing grandmother at the same time? We are about to strip away the silk and the practiced smiles to reveal the woman the Queen privately called the Scrubber. The betrayal did not begin at the deathbed. It was etched into the very foundations of the marriage in 2018. And the Queen, with her eyes failing but her mind sharper than a blade, saw it all coming. Stay with us, because the truth about the operator is more chilling than any fiction Hollywood could ever produce. The Queen's expression of thunder at the wedding was just the beginning of a 1,000-year institution fighting for its very soul. The sun hung high over the ancient turrets of Windsor in the month of May, 2018, casting a golden glow that the world mistook for a benediction. To the billions watching through their digital windows, it was a moment of supreme romance, a Hollywood starlet ascending the steps of St. George's Chapel to join a lineage that stretched back through 1,000 years of blood and iron. But inside the choir, beneath the banners of the Knights of the Garter, the atmosphere was frozen. At the center of this sacred theater sat the sovereign, a woman whose reign had outlasted 10 American presidents and seen the rise and fall of countless empires. As she looked upon the bride, her countenance was not one of grandmotherly affection. It was, as those closest to her whispered later, an expression of thunder. The Queen was not looking at a granddaughter-in-law. She was looking at a transaction. While the global media was intoxicated by the narrative of a modernizing monarchy, the Queen's eyes, sharpened by 7 decades of political intrigue, saw the arrival of the operator. This was the term that began to circulate within the most private corridors of the palace, a clinical assessment of a woman who viewed the British monarchy not as a life of service, but as a global marketing platform. Lady Colin Campbell, the voice that has consistently pierced the veil of royal secrecy, reveals that the Queen's private assessment was devastatingly pejorative. Behind the closed doors of the private apartments, the Duchess was referred to by a much harsher moniker, the Scrubber. This was not a judgment based on class, but on character. The Queen saw a woman who had spent her life meticulously curating an image, a professional climber who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. To the sovereign, Meghan Markle was a predator who had sensed a profound weakness in the royal bloodline. That weakness was Harry. Described by Palace insiders as not the sharpest tool in the box, Harry was the perfect vessel for a woman who intended to use the 1,000-year-old prestige of the crown as a mere springboard for her own celebrity. The Queen's disgust was rooted in a fundamental clash of philosophies. For 70 years, Elizabeth II had lived by the code of never complain, never explain, a philosophy of total self-extinction in service to the crown. In contrast, she saw in Meghan a modern obsession with the self, a woman who believed that her own feelings and her own brand were more significant than the survival of the institution. The expression of thunder at the wedding was a silent recognition that the wolf was no longer at the door. It was standing at the altar, draped in Givenchy silk, and wearing a tiara on loan from the very woman she intended to dismantle. The audacity of the operator reached its zenith when the couple attempted to launch their Sussex royal brand. It was a move of such staggering arrogance that it left the courtiers breathless. They sought to trademark the word royal for commercial gain, intending to sell everything from hoodies to wellness advice under the sovereign's seal. When the Queen moved to block this commercialization of the crown, the response from California was an act of unmitigated heresy. The Duchess's camp issued a statement suggesting that the Queen did not own the word royal. To the Queen, this was more than a disagreement. It was a declaration of war against the state. For a woman who had been anointed with holy oil, and who viewed her role as a sacred trust from God, to be told by a former actress of 2 years' standing that she did not own the essence of her own sovereignty was an unforgivable insult. It was the moment the Queen realized that Meghan Markle did not want to be a royal. She wanted to be a rival. The betrayal ran deeper than mere words. The Queen watched as Harry was systematically hollowed out, his loyalty to his regiment, his family, and his country replaced by the scripted grievances of a Hollywood narrative. She saw her grandson, a man who had once worn the uniform of the Blues and Royals with pride, transformed into a puppet who would eventually slit the throat of his own heritage to satisfy the ego of the woman at his side. The operator believed she was playing a game of checkers, while the Queen was playing a game of chess that had been in progress for 10 centuries. The sovereign knew that the modern world's infatuation with celebrity was a fleeting shadow, while the crown was a mountain. She allowed the marriage to proceed, she gave them the titles, and she gave them the platform not out of weakness, but to allow the operator enough rope to eventually hang her own reputation. But even as the Queen maintained her public mask of recollections may vary, her physical strength was being siphoned away by a secret, agonizing battle with cancer. And it was at this moment of extreme physical vulnerability that Harry and Meghan chose to launch their most lethal strike. They waited until the Queen was blind, frail, and mourning her husband to unleash the Oprah interview, a psychological bombardment designed to shatter the very foundations of the monarchy. How could a grandson be so cruel? How could he watch his grandmother wither away while he stood on a global stage and branded her life's work as a bastion of racism? The answer lies in the dark influence of the operator, and the next chapter of this history reveals the terrifying extent of the physical pain the Queen endured while the Sussexes were busy polishing their grievances. Wait until you hear the true details of the Queen's final physical collapse and the shocking callousness Harry and Meghan showed while she was literally counting her final heartbeats. That is where the brat of Sussex truly earned his exile. While the world looked upon the balcony of Buckingham Palace during the Platinum Jubilee, seeing a sovereign who smiled through the golden haze of 70 years of service, the reality behind the velvet curtains was a harrowing testament to human endurance. Queen Elizabeth II was not merely aging, she was being dismantled from within by a relentless and agonizing foe. The secret that the palace guarded with the ferocity of 1,000 lions was that the Queen was suffering from a severe form of myeloma bone cancer. For a woman of 96, whose entire life was predicated on being the strength and stay of her nation, the physical toll was beyond comprehension. Her bones were becoming as brittle as glass, her marrow was failing, and every step she took across the polished floors of her palaces was a victory of sheer willpower over excruciating pain. Yet, it was in this state of extreme biological vulnerability that the most unforgivable strike was delivered. In the spring of 2021, as the Queen sat in the shadows of Windsor Castle, her eyesight failing, and her husband, Prince Philip, drifting toward death in a hospital bed, the airwaves were hijacked by a spectacle of calculated malice. The Oprah Winfrey interview was not a conversation. It was a psychological bombardment. It was a mental execution of a dying monarch's life work, orchestrated by her own grandson and the woman he had chosen over his country. Imagine the scene. The Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a woman who had kept her vow to God for 7 decades, forced to listen to accusations of systemic racism within her own bloodline. The Sussexes did not merely air grievances. They cast a shadow of suspicion over every member of the royal family, refusing to name the individual they accused, thereby ensuring that the stain of their allegation touched everyone. This was a tactical choice designed to inflict maximum reputational damage, while the Queen was too frail to fight back. To the courtiers who watched the sovereign during those days, it felt as though Harry and Meghan were slitting the throat of the institution, while the woman who wore the crown was gasping for air. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a weapon. Prince Philip, the man who had been the Queen's strength and stay for 73 years, was in his final weeks of life. The Queen was preparing to say goodbye to the only man she had ever loved, yet she was forced to spend her final, precious energy managing a global firestorm ignited by the very people she had protected. The insiders who were close to her at the time speak of a bitter resentment that the Queen held not for the criticism itself, but for the total lack of callousness and empathy shown by Harry. To her, this was a betrayal of the soul. She had shielded Harry after the tragedy of his mother. She had granted him every indulgence, and in return, he chose to brand her legacy as one of bigotry and indifference on a global stage. The physical agony of the bone cancer was secondary to the spiritual ache caused by this betrayal. The Queen was a woman of deep, devout Christian faith, and the concept of family loyalty was sacrosanct to her. To see that loyalty sold for American likes and Netflix, millions was a blow from which she never truly recovered. When she issued the now legendary statement that recollections may vary, it was the ultimate royal rebuke, a cold, elegant way of calling her grandson a liar without ever stooping to his level of vulgarity. It was the last stand of a 1,000-year-old tradition against the shallow, fleeting ethics of a California talk show. But the Sussexes were not finished. Even as the Queen's body continued to fail, as her eyesight grew so dim she could no longer see the faces of her great-grandchildren, the lies continued to flow from Montecito. They claimed they were being cut off financially, ignoring the millions of pounds they had already received. They claimed they were being silenced, even as they occupied every magazine cover and news cycle in the Western world. To the Queen, who had lived through the Blitz and the austerity of the post-war years, this whining from a mansion in California was more than just annoying. It was repulsive. The most devastating part of this chapter was the Queen's realization that Harry was no longer the boy she knew. He had become a puppet of the narrative, a man so thoroughly manipulated by the operator that he could no longer see the damage he was doing to his own grandmother. He was, in the words of the courtiers, the least sharp tool in the box, a man whose insecurities had been weaponized against the very woman who had always been his greatest defender. As the Queen's life ebbed away, she made a final, silent decision. If Harry and Meghan wanted to play the role of victims, if they wanted to use their children as pawns in a game of royal chess, then they would find that the crown has a very long memory. The truth about the titles they claimed were stolen from their son Archie was about to be unleashed. And as we shall see in the next part of this chronicle, the racism lie was about to be dismantled by the very rules of the monarchy that the Sussexes tried so desperately to rewrite. Wait until you hear the truth about the Earl of Dumbarton, the title Harry and Meghan rejected because they were too busy playing the part of the oppressed to accept the honor the Queen had actually bestowed. The reckoning was coming, and it was going to be televised. The most treacherous weapon in the Sussex arsenal was never a truth. It was a carefully constructed vacuum, a hollow space where they invited the world to bury its common sense. In the spring of 2021, as the global audience tuned into the spectacle orchestrated by Oprah Winfrey, a narrative was unleashed that was designed to act as a terminal blow to the moral authority of the British monarchy. The Duchess of Sussex, with a practiced gaze and a voice trembling with scripted emotion, looked directly into the camera and suggested that her son, Archie, had been stripped of his birthright, the title of prince, and denied the protection of the state because of the color of his skin. It was an allegation that ignited a global firestorm, branding a 1,000-year-old institution as a bastion of systemic bigotry. But within the silent, velvet-lined corridors of Buckingham Palace, where every birth and every title is governed by the ironclad laws of history, the reaction was one of profound, cold disgust. The racism narrative was not merely a misunderstanding, it was a calculated manipulation of the public's ignorance regarding the ancient rules of the crown. The reality, documented in the dusty archives of the sovereign's decrees, told a story that was diametrically opposed to the one broadcast from the gardens of California. The status of royal titles is governed by the letters patent issued by King George V in 1917. These rules are as absolute as the tides. They dictate that only the children of the sovereign and the grandchildren of the sovereign in the male line are entitled to the style of prince or princess. At the moment of his birth, Archie was a great-grandchild of the sovereign. He was not by law a prince. He was never denied a title. He simply did not possess the legal pedigree for it under the 100-year-old rules that applied to every other member of the family, including the children of Prince Edward. Yet, the betrayal ran deeper than a mere legal technicality. The Queen, in her enduring generosity, had actually offered a prestigious path for the boy. Upon his birth, Archie was entitled to use the secondary title of his father, the Earl of Dumbarton. It was a noble designation, rooted in the history of the Scottish peerage, a gift from a grandmother to her grandson's firstborn. It carried weight, history, and the protection of the crown. But the Sussexes did the unthinkable. They rejected it. Why would a couple so obsessed with status and security refuse a title for their son? The insiders at the palace reveal a motive that is as shallow as it is cynical. They rejected the title of Earl of Dumbarton because they feared the word dumb within the name would be used to mock the child on social media. They prioritized the potential for digital insults over the dignity of a Scottish earldom. But more importantly, they rejected it because a mere earldom did not fit the narrative of total victimhood they were preparing to sell to the American market. To accept the title of Earl would be to admit that they were being included, honored, and brought into the fold. To reject it allowed them to stand before the world and pretend they had been left with nothing. The Queen was furious about this surrogacy of truth. She saw her grandson, Harry, the man she had once trusted to carry the flame of the monarchy, allowing his wife to weaponize their own child as a political pawn. Harry, whom the courtiers describe as not the sharpest tool in the box, was the perfect accomplice in this deception. He knew the rules of 1917. He knew that his son would automatically become a prince the moment Charles ascended the throne. Yet, he sat in silence, a muted witness to his own family's defamation, while his wife led the world to believe that his own grandmother was a racist who had devalued her own great-grandchild. This was the repulsive nature of the Sussex game. They did not just want a title, they wanted a grievance. They needed the world to believe they were being persecuted so they could justify their multi-million-dollar contracts with streaming giants. They were trading the reputation of the Queen for content. The palace insiders watched in horror as a man who had sworn an oath to the crown stood by as that crown was dragged through the mud by the woman he had permitted to become his master. The Queen's response to this fabricated crisis was a masterclass in regal restraint. She refused to engage in a public shouting match, but she ensured that the truth was whispered into the ears of those who mattered. She knew that the racism lie was a house of cards that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty. And as the Queen's life ebbed away, she ensured that there would be no photographs, no official recognition, and no royal endorsement of the Sussexes' antics. She would not allow the majesty of the monarchy to be used as a backdrop for their victimhood documentaries. As we look toward the next chapter of this crumbling empire, we see the inevitable result of such a treacherous foundation. When you build a brand on a lie, the truth becomes your greatest enemy. The Sussexes had used their children to attack the Queen, but now, with the sovereign gone, they find themselves in a world where the operator has run out of moves and the puppet has run out of strings. The Sussex aura is not just fading. It is being extinguished by the very Hollywood elite they tried so hard to impress. The giants of the entertainment world, the same people who once bowed to the Duchess, are now unloading their own truth about the tattered reputation of the couple who thought they were bigger than a 1,000-year-old throne. The fall was coming, and it was going to be a long, lonely descent into the shadows of history. The gold has begun to tarnish, and the mirage of the Sussex Empire is evaporating under the cold, clinical glare of reality. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Harry and the woman he calls his wife believed they had achieved the impossible. They thought they had successfully transplanted the prestige of a 1,000-year-old monarchy into the shallow, sandy soil of California celebrity. They believed that their titles were a credit card with an infinite limit, a magical pass that would grant them entry into the highest echelons of global power forever. But as the year 2023 dawned, the world witnessed the brutal mechanics of a brand in terminal collapse. The Sussex aura was never a light of their own. It was a borrowed glow from the sovereign they had betrayed. The moment the Queen was laid to rest, the protection of the crown vanished, and the predators of Hollywood began to scent blood in the water. The multi-million-dollar empire they had built on a foundation of grievances started to crumble. When the executive giants at the largest audio streaming platform terminated their contract and publicly branded them as grifters, it was more than just a business failure, it was a social execution. The elite of the entertainment world, the same people who once clamored for an invitation to the wedding in 2018, now viewed them as a liability, a couple who possessed a staggering amount of entitlement, but a notable lack of talent. But the financial decay was merely a symptom of a deeper, more profound moral reckoning. As the Queen's shadow faded, the people she had once protected, the group now known as the Sussex Survivors Club, finally felt empowered to speak. These were the courtiers, the secretaries, and the aides who had served the Duchess during her brief, turbulent tenure at the palace. For years, their stories of her alleged tyranny had been suppressed by the institution's desire for peace and the Queen's personal hope for her grandson's happiness. But now, the dam has burst. They describe a woman who treated the ancient staff of the monarchy like disposable extras in a low-budget Hollywood production. They speak of morning rages, of calculated cruelty, and of a duchess who viewed the quiet, dedicated service of the palace as a personal insult to her brand. The operator had miscalculated the power of the people she looked down upon. She believed that service was a sign of weakness, but she discovered that the institutional memory of the palace is a weapon that never misses its mark. The courtiers have unloaded a decade's worth of evidence, painting a picture of a woman who was not a victim of the system, but a bully who tried to break it. And Harry, the man once beloved for his cheeky spirit, is now viewed through a much darker lens. He is described by those who worked with him as a hollowed-out shell, a man so thoroughly manipulated by the operator's narrative that he became a stranger to his own staff, his own country, and his own blood. The ultimate proof of the Queen's shrewd assessment of the couple lies in a secret incident during the Platinum Jubilee. The Sussexes had arrived in London, desperate for a win to bolster their flagging American ratings. Their primary objective was a single, high-definition photograph of the Queen with her namesake, the child Lilibet. This was not a request born of grandmotherly affection or a desire for family unity. It was a branding asset. They needed that image to prove to their corporate sponsors that they still possessed the royal touch. They needed to monetize the Queen's image one last time. But the Queen, even as her body was being ravaged by the agony of bone cancer, even as she struggled to breathe and stand, remained the ultimate guardian of the crown. She saw the operator's move coming from 1,000 miles away. With a cold, majestic resolve that had been forged over 7 decades of rule, the Queen issued a decree. No. There would be no official photograph. There would be no cameras. She refused to allow her image, her dignity, and the majesty of the monarchy to be used as a commercial prop for a couple who had spent the last 2 years trying to burn her house down. It was a devastating slap in the face delivered with the silent, icy precision of a sovereign who knew exactly who she was dealing with. The rejection was total and absolute. The Sussexes were relegated to the shadows, hidden behind a stone pillar during the service of Thanksgiving, forbidden from appearing on the balcony, and denied the money shot that would have saved their failing business deals. The Queen's refusal to pose with the child was her final, silent verdict on the Sussex era. She was signaling to the world and to history that while the child might be her blood, the Sussex brand was in exile from the royal fold. She would not let the crown be sold at a discount. As the Sussexes slunk back to California, empty-handed and humiliated, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had traded a life of meaningful service for a life of commercial noise, and now the noise was dying down. The Sussex aura had been extinguished by the very woman they thought they could manipulate. They were no longer the future. They were a cautionary tale. Now, with the Queen gone, and King Charles III on the throne, the long game is entering its final, most brutal phase. The era of grandmotherly patience is over. William and Catherine, the future of the monarchy, have no intention of allowing the traitors to return. They are preparing the final playbook, the same one used to erase a king who chose a woman over his duty. The sentence of exile is no longer a possibility. It is an active reality. In our final chapter, you will see how the 1,000-year institution is about to delete Harry and Meghan from the pages of history forever. Stay silent, for the king is coming. The iron gates of history do not merely close. They slam with a finality that echoes for 1,000 years. As the calendar moves toward the year 2026, the strategic maneuvers of the House of Windsor have reached their terminal phase. This is no longer a family disagreement played out in the tabloids. It is a clinical, institutional purge. The sentence of exile has been passed, and the execution of this judgment is being led by the cold, resolute hands of the future, the Prince and Princess of Wales. William and Catherine have watched from the ramparts as the operator and her puppet attempted to dismantle the very foundations of the throne. They witnessed the tears of a dying queen and the exhaustion of a grieving king. Consequently, they have made a collective, unshakable vow: never again. The Sussex era is now being treated as a malignant growth that must be surgically removed to ensure the survival of the crown for the next 100 years. To understand the fate of Harry and the woman he chose, one must look back nearly 100 years to the abdication of Edward VIII. When a prince betrays his oath, the monarchy does not argue, it erases. Edward, once the most popular man in the world, was sent into a gilded wilderness. His titles were hollowed out, his finances were strangled, and he was forced to spend the rest of his life as a social nomad. He became a ghost while he was still breathing, a man whose name was whispered only as a warning. This is the exact protocol being enforced today. The strategy of total severance is 100% complete. First, the financial umbilical cord was severed. Then, the physical sanctuary of their English home was reclaimed. Now, the final stage is underway. The total removal of the Sussexes from the royal narrative. They are no longer invited to the table of the state. They are no longer included in the family ledger. In the eyes of the institution, they have already ceased to exist as royal entities. The Prince of Wales, William, understands the weight of the crown with a clarity that Harry never possessed. He knows that a monarchy cannot survive if it allows its secrets to be sold to the highest bidder. He has watched his brother trade his dignity for a streaming contract, and he has concluded that Harry is no longer a brother, but a security risk. Insiders say that William's resolve is absolute. He has no desire for reconciliation, and no intention of ever allowing the operator to stand on a royal balcony again. For William, the preservation of the throne for his own son George is more important than a sentimental attachment to a brother who has proven himself untrustworthy. And what of the operator? She believed she was bigger than the institution. She believed that Hollywood celebrity was a more potent currency than royal blood, but she has discovered the terrible silence of the crown. By refusing to engage with her, by refusing to provide her with content, the palace has effectively starved her brand. Without the royal connection, she is just another celebrity in a town full of them. A woman whose stories are becoming repetitive and whose grievances have become a punchline. The Sussex aura has turned into a shadow of exile. They sit in their mansion, surrounded by the silence of a world that has moved on. The elite of Hollywood have realized that the Sussexes are toxic assets. To be seen with them is to risk the wrath of the future King and Queen of England. In the world of power, everyone knows that the crown always wins the long game. The Queen's final act was to ensure that the monarchy was left in the hands of those who respected the vow. She saw through the operator from the very beginning, and she spent her final, agonizing months ensuring that the locks were changed before she departed. She knew that Harry had effectively destroyed his own heritage, and she accepted that the only solution was the ancient playbook of exile. It worked before, and it will work again. As we conclude this chronicle, we are left with a haunting image. The British monarchy continues its march through time, a 1,000-year-old vessel that has purged its broken parts and moved into the deep water of the future. And on the far shore, Harry and his wife remain. They are the footnotes of a failed rebellion, the cautionary tale that will be told to future generations of princes. They thought they were the new face of the monarchy, but they were merely a brief fever that the institution has now broken. The doors of the castle are locked. The keys have been destroyed. The names have been struck from the guest list. The sentence of exile is permanent. For in the world of kings and queens, there is no crime greater than the betrayal of a dying sovereign. The operator has run out of moves, and the puppet has run out of time. The crown remains. The traitors are forgotten. The lock has been changed forever. That is the only verdict that matters in the history of a 1,000-year dynasty.